Hello and welcome to today's episode of the research project series of Bright on Buddhism, where I'll be discussing and presenting some of my own original research into topics of Buddhism, making use of various primary and secondary sources to craft an argument and/or a narrative about a given topic. Today's episode will focus on Aikido, a Japanese martial art with some strong connections to Japanese religions, including Buddhism and Shinto. Aikido is one of the less popular Japanese martial arts compared to karate, judo, or jiu-jitsu, but it's still widely practiced throughout Japan and all over the world. It's incredibly hard to keep track of how many active members there are in Aikido because of a few reasons, such as that many members practice only for a few years at a time, or they practice irregularly. But by my own experience training in Aikido for 5 years, there are about 20,000 to 40,000 active members of mainline Aikido worldwide, including in Japan. I make the distinction of mainline Aikido because the type of Aikido that I practiced is not considered mainline, as we'll discuss. I practice a type called Shinshin Toitsu Aikido, and there are other subtypes, such as Aiki-Jujitsu and more. It is similarly less violent and less confrontational than other martial arts. Whereas karate relies strongly on strikes and kicks, and judo relies on grappling and wrestling, Aikido does not rely on any strikes or kicks, and thus advertises itself as an entirely non-violent martial art. Instead, it relies on throws, joint locks, and pins. For the purposes of this episode, we will go through a brief history and examination of mainline Aikido via a biography of its founder, Ueshiba Morihei, and a discussion of its principles and practices. In doing so, we'll discuss what the name of the martial art means and how those meanings factor into its practice. Then we'll go through a brief history of Shinshin Toitsu Aikido and a biography of its founder, Ueshiba Morihei's top student, Tohei Koichi. Then there will be a similar discussion of its principles and practices. Then I will provide a discussion of its relationships to Japanese religions in terms of ritual, practice, and meaning. Finally, we will conclude with a brief discussion of my own experiences as a practitioner of Shinshin Toitsu Aikido. Thus, this will hopefully serve as a history of the martial art, an examination of its religious and political themes and roots, and a discussion of what it's actually like to practice it. I hope you enjoy. Let's get started with our discussion of Ueshiba Morihei. As I mentioned, Aikido was founded by Ueshiba Morihei, who lived from 1883 to 1969. He got a brief description in episode 104, What is the Relationship Between Buddhism and Martial Arts, and some of that discussion will be repeated here, but with some more biographical details. He was born in Nishinotani village in Tanabe, which is a city in present-day Wakayama Prefecture. He was born to a relatively wealthy farming family. Ueshiba was not very strong or athletic as a child. He was rather small and thin, and he was sick a lot. To counteract this and strengthen his body and his constitution, his father tried to get him to take up sumo wrestling and swimming to build up muscle and to get healthy. This was his first encounter with martial arts. Additionally, another very influential figure in his life was one of his school teachers, Tasabudo Nasu, who was a Shinto priest. This priest took a liking to him and gave him an education in the Shinto and Confucian classics. Ueshiba did not take well to the Confucian classics, but did enjoy learning about performing rituals. His schoolmaster, Mitsugi Fujimoto, was also a priest of Shingon Buddhism, and he taught Ueshiba some of the mantras and ritual observances of Shingon. Ueshiba then trained at Jizo-deru Temple and was encouraged by his teachers and his schoolmaster to join the priesthood, either in Shinto or in Buddhism, but his father wouldn't let him join, so he was educated as an accountant instead. After graduating from school, he worked at a local tax office for a while, but he really didn't like that job, so in 1901 he got some money from his father to move to Tokyo. Here he tried to open a stationery shop called Ueshiba Stationery, but that didn't really work out either, and while he was there he got sick with beriberi, or thiamine deficiency, so he returned to Tanabe. Shortly after returning, he got married to his childhood friend Hatsu Itokawa. In 1903, at age 20, Ueshiba was called up for military service. He failed the initial medical examination, being shorter than the minimum regulation height of 5 feet 2 inches, by 1/2 inch. To get around this and earn recruitment into the military, he is said to have stretched his spine by attaching heavy weights to his legs and suspending himself from tree branches. When he retook the physical exam, he found that he had increased his height by the necessary 1/2 inch to pass. So he was assigned to the Osaka 4th Division, 37th Regiment, and then served on the front lines of the Russo-Japanese War, after which he was promoted to corporal of the 61st Wakayama Regiment and then to sergeant. We've not really talked about it much on the show, but the Russo-Japanese War was a brief aggression by the Japanese on the Russian Empire over control of Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. It was one of the first military expansions made by the Japanese Empire in a phase of imperialistic expansionism that would last until 1945. Ueshiba was discharged from the military in 1907 and again returned to Tanabe, where he and his wife had their first child, a daughter named Matsuko, who was born in 1911. During this period in Japanese history, Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, was in the process of being conquered and integrated into the borders of the Empire of Japan. People don't often know this, but previously, the island had belonged to the indigenous Ainu people. But the Japanese Empire had made several military forays into the region for centuries leading up to the 20th century, and it was finally declared Japanese land in 1869. After this time, it was treated very much like the American West, or Alaska, in the earlier history of the United States. The Japanese government offered land grants and subsidies to settle Japanese people in the region and farm or otherwise extract valuable resources. Indigenous Ainu people be damned. This was very similar to the Homestead Act of 1862 in America, which basically declared that people could claim parcels of land for farming, resource extraction, and residence. In 1912, Ueshiba recruited several families that he knew or was associated with to join him, and he became the leader of the Kishu Settlement Group, a collective of 85 pioneers, mostly friends and family, who intended to settle the Shirataki district and live as farmers. They founded the village of Shirataki in 1912. Shirataki is in the very far northeast of Japan, almost all the way to the Kamchatka Peninsula of present-day Russia. It overlooks the Sea of Okhotsk, and it is part of the present-day Okhotsk sub-prefecture of Hokkaido. When they arrived, the farm got off to a very rocky start, but they were eventually able to get a small mint and livestock operation going after a couple of years. Hokkaido, like the northern reaches of the North American West, also had a strong logging and timber industry as well, and so by 1918, there were over 500 families residing in Shirataki. In 1915, Ueshiba met Takeda Sokaku, the founder of Daitoryu Aikijujutsu. Ueshiba was deeply impressed with Takeda's martial art and began to train with him. He would eventually rise to very high rank and become a teacher of the style, which is one of the clear ancestors of Aikido, relying on some weapon work but mainly on throws and empty-hand close-quarters combat. The relationship between Ueshiba and Takeda was very fraught. They seemed to be competing to be the most well-known and well-renowned martial artist of their times, and so they were very respectful to each other's faces, but they always had backhand and ulterior motives in how they acted around each other. Takeda was a teacher to Ueshiba, but Ueshiba always wanted to outpace him and claim his authority over his martial arts lineage. Similarly, although Takeda was Ueshiba's instructor, he also sought to undermine or take over Ueshiba's efforts to develop and teach Aikido. Their relationship would last for many years to come. In 1918, Ueshiba met Onisaburo Deguchi, the leader of the Omotokyo New Religious Movement. This was a hyper-conservative Shinto New Religious Movement in the early 20th century. I say hyper-conservative for a few reasons. One is that the name translates to Great Origin or Great Source, and that gives a sense of what they're all about. They believe that there is a singular spirit or deity that manifests into all the different kami or Shinto gods, and that Japan ought to go back to the old kami worship traditions in order to get closer to that god. In doing this, they would realize utopia or paradise on earth. That god is said to be Ushitora no Konjin, an evil kami in the mainline Shinto tradition, who they actually believe to be a benevolent creator god. They're very agrarian, very pro-Japanese empire, and very make Japan great again. They believe that world peace and utopia was achievable, but only by a benevolent dictatorship of the Japanese Empire over all other countries of the world. For their Shinto heterodoxy, which, as we've discussed before, props up the imperial family to a great deal, they were actually raided by the Japanese government twice. Ueshiba became great friends with Deguchi and even relocated his family down to Kyoto, where their headquarters was, and became the martial arts instructor for the group. In this capacity, he became very close with several prominent figures of the Japanese pro-imperial far right, and he was a very conservative, nationalist, and imperialist person himself. He even set up a paramilitary corps for Omotokyo, and narrowly avoided persecution himself on many occasions due to his close association with Deguchi. In 1924, Deguchi and Ueshiba got a few members of Omotokyo, and they set off on a journey to Mongolia at the invitation of the retired naval captain Yutaro Yano and his associates within the ultranationalist Black Dragon Society. Their goal in going there was to establish a new religious kingdom in Mongolia, Mongolian sovereignty be damned, and this kingdom was to serve as the seed crystal for the aforementioned benevolent dictatorship over all other countries. To this end, Deguchi even claimed or suggested that he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. Deguchi's group were arrested in Tongliao by Chinese authorities, and the Japanese group of the little commune was released into the custody of the Japanese consul in China. They were returned under armed guard to Japan, where Deguchi was imprisoned and where Ueshiba himself was left to go free. It's not entirely clear how Ueshiba avoided imprisonment in this, but it was likely due to the fact that it was his first public offense with the Omotokyo group, whereas Deguchi himself had been on the government's radar for a long time by that point because of his heterodox Shinto views. Later in 1925, Ueshiba had a spiritual experience, stating that, quote, "I felt the universe suddenly quake and a golden spirit sprang up from the ground, veiled my body, and changed my body into a golden one. At the same time, my body became light. I was able to understand the whispering of the birds and was aware of the mind of God, the creator of the universe. At that moment, I was enlightened. The source of Buddho, the martial way, is God's love, the spirit of loving protection for all things. Buddho is not the felling of an opponent by force, nor is it a tool to lead the world to destruction with arms. True Buddho is to accept the spirit of the universe, keep the peace of the world, correctly produce, protect, and cultivate all beings in nature." Unquote. After this experience, his martial arts technique became gentler and with a greater emphasis on the manipulation of ki, spelled Ki, the Japanese rendition of Chinese chi. Soon after, he began teaching Aikido more or less in the form that we know it today. Now would be a good time to explain the meaning of the name Aikido and how it applies to the practice of the martial art. The word Aikido consists of three characters: I, meaning harmonization, Ki, meaning chi as in Chinese, and Do, meaning the way of practice. So the whole name means the way of practice of harmonizing Ki, or the way of practicing to achieve harmony with Ki. As you can see from his spiritual experience, there are themes of nonviolence against all sentient beings and the harmonization with the divine. Ki, as we have discussed, is very analogous to the Force in Star Wars. It is the non-material component to all matter on Earth, and it is the stuff of life and of mind. It surrounds us all, reflects us all, and is shared by us all. We'll come back to Ki philosophy more soon. After returning to Ayabe, Ueshiba began regularly performing meditations and ritual ablutions in the Nachi Falls as part of a Shinto purification ritual called Mitsugi, and he continued to train and teach martial arts. He became very famous, and he was invited to Tokyo to open up a dojo to teach high-ranking military members, politicians, and the wealthy elite. He continued to have a friendship and relationship with Omotokyo and Onisaburo Deguchi, even though Deguchi was under close government surveillance and was in and out of jail a few times during this time period. As I mentioned, he even secretly helped set up a paramilitary group for Omotokyo, and when this group was discovered, Deguchi was arrested again, but Ueshiba avoided arrest because he happened to be close friends with the chief of police from training him after opening up his dojo in Tokyo. Ueshiba then retired to Iwama in Ibaraki Prefecture to the northeast of Tokyo, where he resided through World War II. After the war concluded, he trained some Americans in Hawaii and then passed away after a battle with liver cancer in 1969. The Aikido lineage was then inherited by Ueshiba's son, Kisshōmaru, father of the current lineage president, Morihei. Now we can begin to discuss the actual physical practice of Aikido. After the previously mentioned spiritual experiences, Ueshiba became softer, gentler, and more focused on the esoteric, the philosophical, and the internal cultivations of his martial art. In this way, he grew apart from Takeda Sokaku and other high-ranking military martial arts teachers. Also, he became increasingly moderate in his pro-empire, pro-military, pro-war opinions. He eventually began to calm down and advocate for non-violence and harmony and peace. In this way, his martial arts practice and teaching similarly softened to be as safe, non-violent, and soft as possible. The entire martial art is taught as defenses against various types of strikes and various disarming moves against people wielding various weapons, such as a sword, a staff, or a knife. The resultant throws, joint locks, and pins are never meant to interrupt, conflict with, or stop the attacker's momentum, intention, or the direction of their ki. You instead redirect it by putting yourself in their place and using their momentum to throw them, or otherwise get them away from you and stop the fight that way. These principles carry over to Shinshin Toitsu Aikido, the version I trained in. There are a number of joint lock and throw techniques that all signify different movements and positions in Aikido. For example, there are 5 wrist lock techniques, which all indicate different ways to pin and throw attackers based on holding their wrists. There are a few different techniques as well of throws and pins based on if you turn away or turn into your attacker when they're attacking you. There are throws you can do from a seated position. There are disarming moves you can do if you're attacked with a weapon. And there are different techniques for you if you have multiple attackers coming at you. None of these techniques involve the defending person striking, kicking, or hitting the attacker in any way. And that's how it's different from karate, judo, or jujitsu. Instead, you softly and safely throw and pin the attacker until they're restrained or deterred from attacking you further. Now we'll go through a brief history of Shinshin Toitsu Aikido and a biography of its founder, Ueshiba Morihei's top student, Tohei Koichi. Tohei Koichi was born in Tokyo in 1920 and was very sickly as a child, just like Ueshiba. And to overcome this, he trained in various athletic, martial, and ascetic practices to try and strengthen his constitution. He is said to have primarily trained in judo. After strengthening his body and overcoming his being sickly and small as a child, he then discovered meditative and ascetic practices and enrolled at the Ichikukai Dojo in Tokyo. The Ichikukai Dojo mainly taught Zen seated meditation and a breathing practice called Mitsugi no Kokyu-ho, a version of Mitsugi purification with breathing exercises involved. Right before enrolling at college at Keio University to study economics, he developed pleurisy, a painful inflammatory breathing condition. He continued to train, however, despite his health problems, and eventually recovered from pleurisy. His training regimen was truly insane. He took classes at Keio during the day, trained judo in the evenings, and then practiced with Ichikukai at night, so he slept very little and put his body and mind through an incredibly difficult cycle of training. However, despite this, he still recovered from pleurisy and did well in all 3 activities. Soon after, Tohei became a bit disillusioned with judo and wanted to seek out something softer, so at age 19 in 1940, his judo instructor recommended he meet Ueshiba. Tohei had doubts, but he still gave Ueshiba a chance. He watched Ueshiba do his techniques on students and instructors, but still wanted to experience the techniques for himself, so he had Ueshiba perform the techniques on him. This immediately convinced him. The techniques were softer, yet still more powerful than anything he'd experienced in judo or any other martial art. He had an impression of them being strengthened by ki, the vital life force or energy that we've discussed before, as opposed to brute muscular force. This would become very influential on him, and he asked to be enrolled in Ueshiba's martial arts school on the spot. Tohei then trained with Ueshiba and was even allowed to teach during a short period of 6-ish months before he got recruited for military service in the Asia-Pacific War. In 1944, he was stationed in China, which Japan had invaded a number of years prior. There's a famous story in Aikido circles that while there, he developed dysentery from drinking bad water, and to treat himself for this, he did something that would come to be called Kiatsu on his stomach. Kiatsu is strongly based in Chinese acupuncture, making use of the same meridians used in that system, But instead of applying needles to the intersections of meridians, the Kiatsu practitioner extends ki through their fingers and thumbs and presses them gently into the meridian lines. In doing this, several kinds of issues can be remedied, including illness, injury, pain, soreness, and more. This episode of his life contributed strongly to the development of Kiatsu, which is now taught as a regular part of the Aikido curriculum. Extending ki would also come to be regarded as critically important to Tohei in general, and now might be a good time to explain what I mean when I talk about extending ki. So I've mentioned that ki is analogous to Chinese qi, and it represents this vital life force that we all have. In Aikido philosophy, a singular point in our center of gravity, right below the belly button, known in Japanese as the Seika no Itten, or in English as the one point, is the ocean of ki, and this ki travels along meridians and can be extended out of our fingertips. This extension is simultaneously an extension of our awareness and senses, but also an extension of our minds and intention. Thus, Aikido is a redirection or a harmonization of ki between people. Similarly, according to Kiatsu therapy techniques, injuries and illnesses are a result of clogs of ki or weak ki along the meridians, and Kiatsu therapy reintroduces ki to the meridian to support the cultivation of ki flow in the person's body. Tohei would then be discharged and repatriated to Japan in 1946, where he continued to train with Ueshiba. In 1952, Ueshiba put Tohei in charge of introducing Aikido to the West, and so on several occasions, Tohei traveled to Hawaii, Europe, and to the Western US to teach Aikido to police officers, athletes, and more. All the while, he continued to rise through the ranks in Aikido, and in 1969 he attained the highest possible rank, 10th Dan, or 10th degree black belt. This would make him the head instructor of all Aikido. Soon after, however, Ueshiba died, and the lineage was inherited by his son, Ueshiba Kisshōmaru. Here there arose a point of conflict. The head instructor and the highest ranking person in the world was not the inheritor of the lineage. This exacerbated an ongoing awkward situation between Tohei and the rest of Aikido senior instructors. Tohei, in traveling worldwide to teach Aikido, had landed on what he believed were very straightforward terms for teaching Aikido principles, emphasizing the role of experience-based learning, ki and its manipulation, and practical considerations in explaining the martial art. Then he would go back and train with Ueshiba, and the teaching would be super esoteric and lofty and hard to understand unless you yourself were thrown by him and you got to feel and experience what he was talking about firsthand. In other words, Tohei increasingly came to think that Ueshiba was a bad teacher, and that he wasn't emphasizing ki in his philosophy nearly as much as he should have been. Tohei actually began to teach this way, even though other instructors under Ueshiba did not, and this started to alienate him from them. Tensions festered until 1971, when Tohei founded the Ki no Kenkyukai, or the Ki Research Society, which was meant to be outside of the Ueshiba Aikido umbrella and to assuage the concerns of the instructors, who were getting increasingly upset with him teaching what they thought was a heterodox version of the martial art. However, founding this Ki no Kenkyukai, also called the Ki Society, actually made things worse between Tohei and the other senior instructors. So, in 1974, he officially left mainline Aikido to set all of his focus on Ki no Kenkyukai and founded his new separate style of Aikido, which he would call Shinshin Toitsu Aikido. This name literally translates to the way of harmonizing ki through unification of mind and body. He made the headquarters of this style in Tochigi Prefecture, about 3 hours northwest of Tokyo in the outskirts of the city of Utsunomiya. In this branch of Aikido, he would teach the martial art, called Shinshin Toitsu Aikido, Kiatsu, the acupressure practice he developed during the war, ki breathing, a slow tidal breathing technique, ki meditation, a meditative technique focusing on the nature of ki as all-pervading and infinitely expanding and constricting, and ki development exercises, which were methods of realizing oneness of mind and body, either through a rhythmic dancing exercise, through ringing a bell, or things like this. When he broke away to teach these martial arts, he ended up teaching several notable martial artists, including Steven Seagal, David Shaner, my own teacher, Christopher Curtis, who I trained with, and many more. He taught all over the world until his death in 2011. So what are the principles and tenets of what he actually taught? There are 4 core principles to all Shinshin Toitsu Aikido practice. They are 1. Keep one point, which means allow your mind to come to rest in the one point, the Seika no Itten, and to move from that point, rather than move from your chest or your head. 2. Relax completely, which means don't hold any tension in any part of your body because it prevents the flow of ki. 3. Keep weight underside, also sometimes called have a light feeling. This is similar to the previous one. Don't be tense and don't be easy to knock over. 4. Extend ki. Allow ki to flow outside of your body through your fingertips, through your wrists, or whatever outlet the situation calls for. All techniques in Shinshin Toitsu Aikido have the following sequence, thus making the following the 5 core principles for actually how to do Aikido techniques. 1. Ki is extending, which follows up on the 4th core principle. 2. Know your partner's mind. By extending ki, you can read whatever the other person intends to do to you, be it punch, kick, or grab. 3. Respect your partner's ki, meaning don't interrupt or reject or fight back against that intention as you may want to. This causes a conflict where whoever's the strongest wins. Aikido purports to be non-violent, and it purports to be available to literally everybody, regardless of size or physical strength. And so it will not be Aikido if you choose to fight back in a violent manner. 4. Put yourself in your partner's place. Instead of rejecting or interrupting or fighting back against your partner's ki, you put yourself physically and metaphorically in their place as an extension of knowing their mind and respecting their intention and their position. 5. Lead with confidence. You lead the situation to a mutually beneficial conclusion, either by throwing somebody safely or by stopping the fight with a non-lethal, non-dangerous, non-painful pin or joint lock. In Aikido, they also practice with sword, staff, and knife, particularly in how to defend against attacks with these weapons, whether you yourself are armed or not. In Shinshin Toitsu Aikido, rank has several layers. The lowest ranks are the 6 Qs. Q is Japanese for level. 6th Q is everybody in the world who doesn't practice Aikido. They are the lowest ranking, and in America they would wear a white belt. Then they take the 5th Q test, which introduces 5 martial arts. When you are 5th Q, you wear a blue belt if you're in the West. Then you take a 4th Q test with more arts, which makes you a purple belt. Then you take a test for 3rd Q with a 2nd purple belt, then 2nd Q, which is brown belt, then 1st Q, which is 2nd brown belt. In Japan, you wear white belts all the way up until you get your first black belt. After that, you reach Dan rankings. Dan is Japanese for rank or platform, and it includes all black belts. In Shinshin Toitsu Aikido, there are 8 attainable degrees of black belt. Layered on top of that are ki development ranks, which have to do with more subtle and esoteric levels of ki development. There are 3 of these ranks, which are Shoden, Chuden, and Okuden. Shoden does not occur until you're already on the black belt, and few people on Earth hold the Okuden rank. Now I'll provide a discussion of its relationships to Japanese religions in terms of ritual, practice, and meaning. First, there are some historical relationships. For example, we talked about how Ueshiba had a very strong connection to Shinto and to Shingon Buddhism, as well as to the Shinto new religious movement Omotokyo. We've already discussed this, so we won't go over it again. Tohei did not have a strong connection or affiliation any more than the average Japanese person to any religious institution, but he did incorporate Shinto and Zen Buddhist practices very strongly into the practices of Shinshin Toitsu Aikido. For example, Mitsugi is a purification in sacred water that comes from Shinto, and is inherited in mainline and in Shinshin Toitsu Aikido. In both, there is a ritual that involves dousing oneself in cold water while chanting. Additionally, there is a bell ringing ritual called Sokushin no Gyo that involves chanting the name of the kami while ringing a bell. Bell ringing is very common at Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines as a means of inviting the gods to the shrine to commune with you. And while that is a part of the purpose of the ritual, it's not the primary purpose. Indeed, the primary purpose is to cultivate and exercise your ki. Ki meditation is also very similar to Zazen, or seated Zen meditation, due in large part to Tohei's practice with the Ichikukai dojo, the Zen dojo in Tokyo. To practice ki meditation, you sit seiza, or sit on your ankles with your hands on your thighs, and you feel or experience or meditate on the infinite expansion and infinite constriction of ki. This is like feeling the Force in Star Wars or something like that. In doing so, you sail the ocean of ki, and you cultivate your connection to the ki of the universe, and you improve the mental and spiritual aspect of your practice and of your training. Similarly to this, in mainline Zen Buddhist practice, particularly in Zazen, you are said to have an experience of Shinjin Datsuraku, or the shedding of body and mind, where your connection to the idea of self as your ego, your body, or of anything like that breaks down, and you connect with emptiness, with Buddhahood, or something similar. There are also similar principles in Shinshin Toitsu Aikido and in Buddhism, such as nonviolence against all sentient beings and more. I completed an undergraduate thesis on this topic, specifically arguing that the historical and cultural relationships that exist between mainline Aikido, Shinshin Toitsu Aikido, and Shinto and Zen Buddhism resonate into practical, ritual, and pedagogical aspects of the martial arts themselves. As we've discussed on the show before, most Japanese people identify as Buddhist, Shinto, or both, and so it is not unexpected to find it resonating in Japanese martial arts and ascetic practices. It doesn't necessarily mean that Shinshin Toitsu Aikido is religiously affiliated. Indeed, it advertises itself as being strictly non-religious and open to all religious backgrounds. This is true, by the way. There is no religious indoctrination, and attainment of rank in Aikido does not translate to any rank in any ecumenical or religious structure outside of Aikido. Before I conclude the episode, I would like to discuss my own experience when I practiced Shinshin Toitsu Aikido in college. Soon after enrolling at my undergraduate university, Furman University, in 2015, I discovered a small martial arts club that practiced Shinshin Toitsu Aikido. At the time, I was struggling a great deal with my mental health. I had reached the age where if someone is going to develop anxiety or depression, it would start to present, and it had started to present. I was struggling with regular panic attacks and generalized anxiety and depression. Let me stress that at the time that I found Shinshin Toitsu Aikido, I wasn't looking for a martial arts club or looking to start martial arts practice. However, when I was having my freshman orientation at Furman University, I met the club captain at that time, somebody named Matthew Atarian, who's still practicing Aikido to this day, and he turned me on to the martial art immediately. I joined the club, which was taught by Dr. Mark Stone, who had achieved the rank of 6th degree black belt, or 6th dan, by that time, and I was immediately enthralled with it. I loved the club, I loved the martial art, and I loved training. I got very close with Mark Stone, David Shaner, Matthew Atarian, and many others in the martial art. Through training with the club, I was able to travel to Japan twice, both times to Tokyo and Utsunomiya, for the purpose of training with Aikido students and instructors from all over the world. I traveled for the first time in 2016 for a month or so to stay at headquarters in their dorms there and train for 6 hours a day, sometimes even training with the current lineage president, Tohei Shinichi. During that time, I also trained with Japanese students from all over Japan who came to train at the headquarters dojo. The second time I went was in 2017 for a worldwide training seminar with members from all over the globe. I met people from Germany, Spain, France, the whole US, Japan, Russia, South America, and more. These trips to Japan were life-changing for me. They opened my eyes to Japanese religions and changed my career path from going into medicine to becoming a scholar of Japanese Buddhism. Similarly, the Aikido training did wonders for the generalized anxiety and depression as well as the panic attacks that I was suffering from at the time. I trained for a total of 5 years, reaching the rank of Shodan, or first degree black belt. After that time, the COVID-19 pandemic began, and I moved to Illinois for graduate school, and then to Seattle a year and a half ago, and I've since stopped training and teaching Shinshin Toitsu Aikido. Part of my reason for stopping training was because I moved to a region without an available dojo to train at. There are only around 10 or so dojos in the US, in New Jersey, Washington, D.C., South Carolina, Arizona, Minnesota, Texas, and California, and a few others. There was no dojo, however, in Illinois when I moved there. Another reason for stopping is that having exams after the first black belt becomes very costly and very political in Shinshin Toitsu Aikido. Once you reach a certain rank, each test starts to cost in the thousands of dollars. There are ways to get financial help if you can't afford to take that test, but there is an expected donation. Similarly, you can only ever be tested by ever higher ranking individuals, up to a point where you can only be tested by the president of the Shinshin Toitsu Aikido lineage, Tohei Shinichi, son of Tohei Koichi himself, and a group of senior instructors. Once you reach these higher levels, then the minute details of your rank and your skill become much more subjective and become exponentially harder to actually test for as you would do in the lower ranks. These lead to what I understand to be very political considerations for higher ranks. For example, you may be more favorably viewed in your higher level examinations if you have contributed a lot to the Ki Aikido organization, either by teaching it, by giving a lot of money to it, or something like that. Now, obviously, rank is unimportant in the grand scheme of things. Training is and should be about getting better than you were before, not about getting increasing levels of authority. But you still can't have practice in Shinshin Toitsu Aikido without that structure of ranking. So if you want to practice just for your own self-cultivation and your own enjoyment, but you refuse to test for actual belts and actual rankings, then that creates an incredibly awkward situation. In Japanese culture, social hierarchies are defined by what is referred to in Japanese as joge kankei, or up-down relationships. In other words, when you join a company, you may share the same job title with a number of other people, but ranking among those people with that job title is defined by the amount of time that a person has had in that position. In other words, the person who's been there the longest is the highest ranking, even if you all have the same job title. As another example, in schools, if you're a 9th grader, then the 10th graders have seniority over you, and you have seniority over the 8th graders. This doesn't mean you have real authority over them, but culturally it determines how, when, and to whom respect ought to be meted out. This exact same sort of structure is imported to Aikido. People of the same rank level must defer to the person who has been that rank the longest, and people of one rank level must defer to the people above that rank level, whereas the people below it must defer to them. However, if somebody's time in a rank outpaces their rank and the amount of time that others have been there, then it becomes unclear who has seniority. In other words, if somebody trains as a 6th Q white belt for 20 years, then I would outrank them as somebody who has earned a Shodan black belt. But they would outrank me because they've trained for 20 years. In that situation, who has the authority? Is it me who has titular rank over them, or is it them who has experiential rank over me? Who calls who sensei, which is Japanese for instructor or teacher? The answer is not clear, and this creates a lot of awkward situations. Thus, it rules out training just because you love it and enjoy it without having to go through the rigid testing and ranking structure. And then on the flip side, many Westerners who train in Aikido and in all martial arts train because they love the rank and the hierarchical power structure that rank creates. That is in fact the specific reason why belts have colors in the West for all martial arts. You'll remember that I mentioned that all students are white belts until they're black belts when they train in Japan, but in America, they have blue, purple, and brown belts to denote their different ranks. This is specifically to clarify and reward the hierarchy of rank among American practitioners and European and Western practitioners. I've tried out many martial arts since beginning Aikido, and I find that in the West, many of them are cults of rank and cults of experience, and I have a suspicion from training a few times in Japan that it is sometimes the same situation there as well. When I say a cult of rank or a cult of experience, I mean that many people look upon higher-ranking individuals as being further along on the path to godhood than anybody else. And then similarly, people with higher rank come to expect, with upturned nose, all kinds of respect and veneration just simply for their rank and experience. This isn't universally true, but it's true enough that it can put some people off from training in Shinshin Toitsu Aikido and other martial arts. A part of Aikido training, for example, is to serve as otomo. The nominal purpose of this role in your training is to train the student to be mindful and attentive to an instructor's needs. You're said to learn how to know a person's mind without staring them to death or asking them a bunch of questions about their intentions and what they want and what they need at a given time. In reality, you fold and wash their uniforms, you help them change clothes, you arrange their meals, their travel, and their lodging, and you essentially act as their valet. all while you're supposed to also be training yourself. Meaning that as you're supposed to be acting as a valet for your instructor, you also still have to receive instruction on the mat and practice everything that the instructor teaches you. The rhetoric about mindfulness and attentiveness, while not being intrusive or bothersome, seems to me like it could be post hoc reasoning. It sounds like they wanted to integrate valeting into the training and then dress it up in pretty packaging. Similarly, there is a fluidity of interpretation of the teaching that seems incongruent with the rigid ranking system. In other words, interpretations and ways of presenting, practicing, and teaching various aspects of Aikido differ greatly between high-ranking teachers. Sometimes they differ in small ways, but other times they differ in incredibly large and important ways. In some sense, this is okay, because it values individual experiences and it encourages people to train with a wide variety of people to become a well-rounded martial artist. In another sense, however, this can be really bad. Of course, it means that the martial art comes to be inconsistent in that way, and you never really know if you're doing it right or not because there is no codified right or wrong. But then in the other sense, it means that rank is right, and this exacerbates the ranking issue that I discussed a moment ago. If Tohei Shinichi Sensei does something a certain way, it's right, period, no question. It doesn't matter if Tohei Koichi did it differently. It doesn't matter if people who are older and have trained longer than Tohei Shinichi do it differently. Tohei is right. In this way, his status as the son of the founder and the inheritor of the lineage and the president of the martial art is worshipped. He can do no wrong, and so he has unitary executive authority over all Shinshin Toitsu Aikido. In my opinion, that means that this is not a tradition of martial arts, it's a cult of the Tohei family. He has near unlimited authority over the martial art and everyone in it with regards to how they practice. This power structure is similar to the authority problems that have existed in American Zen Buddhism since the 1960s or American Tibetan Buddhism since the 70s that have led to various kinds of abuse of the teacher-student relationship, including sexual, emotional, physical, all these different types of abuse that we've seen over there. To clarify, I did not experience or see any such abuse in Shinshin Toitsu Aikido ever. Furthermore, no public record of any such abuse exists anywhere in the world. Nobody has come forward and accused a teacher of inappropriate or unlawful behavior in the Shinshin Toitsu Aikido tradition. I'm simply stating that the power structure is no different than that of the Zen and Tibetan Buddhist institutions in America where abuse has taken place. Similarly, I would also add that power structures such as these are their own pressure, their own deterrent against victims coming forward if they do exist. In other words, when a person or a group has such authority over a person's mind and body, especially if it's just perceived authority and not real authority, that deters people from coming forward if they become victims of abuse. Because they're just one person, and the abuser is not just an individual. They represent the entire group or the entire organization. So the victim fears that if they come forward and accuse somebody of wrongdoing, then it's their word against not just their abuser, but the entire organization. I don't think that structures like that really should exist at all. They're very dangerous and unhealthy, even if nothing bad ever happens, as is, I suppose, the case with Aikido. Overall, I'm very thankful for the time and energy that my teachers and my fellow students put into me, and I'm grateful for the experience I had with Shinshin Toitsu Aikido. My life would not be the same at all, and would likely be much worse, if not for having encountered Aikido. I have no ill will toward any individual or group of individuals in the entire martial art. Many of them are people I hold very dear to me and care very much about. However, the entire structure, the entire history, the entire organization is simply not something I want to be a part of at this stage in my life. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the Research Project series on Aikido, its history, its connection to Japanese religion, and my own experiences with it. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. If you like our show and you want to support us, we ask instead that you send that support to Black families that have been displaced by the LA wildfires. You can find a directory of GoFundMe pages for these families in the show notes. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.